I'm Davie Black, and I'm the Access and Conservation Officer for Mountaineering Scotland. What we're going to be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes maybe, we'll see how long I blather on for. We'll be talking about access and conservation of the Scottish mountains, what that involves, and what it means for you, me, and for everyone else. I'll give a brief introduction, first of all, about Mountaineering Scotland, just in case you're not quite sure who we are and what we do, and then we'll launch into it. So keep your questions ready, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them as we go along. Right, Mountaineering Scotland, it's the national representative body for mountaineers, hill walkers, climbers, snow sport tourers who live in Scotland or who enjoy Scotland's mountains. We've got nearly 15,000 members, and we promote safety and skills. We campaign to safeguard access rights and responsibilities, which will be the first part of the talk. And we seek to protect Scotland's mountain landscapes from various bits and pieces. You'll find out more about that in the second half of the presentation. So what do? We represent the interests of walkers and climbers, both indoors and out. And we look at to promote enjoyment, safety, and risk awareness. As you can see, there's quite a lot of stuff in there. We want to create a sort of a self-reliant and sustainable community of people enjoying the mountains. And it's that safety and sort of self-reliance as well, and access to the hill and crag, and protect the mountain environment from all sorts of damage. So that's basically what we're about. We're 50 years old this year. So what happened was that the British Mountaineering Council started in 1945, and Scottish interests were represented in the BMC by the Association of Scottish Climbing Clubs. But by 1960s, things were moving apace politically, and there was all sorts of stuff going on with the sort of political, legislative, cultural differences in there. And in 1970, Mountaineering Council of Scotland was formed from the Association of Scottish Climbing Clubs to represent the views of mountaineers in Scotland. So that was the MCFS as it was, and in 2016 we rebranded as Mountaineering Scotland. So you can see the range of things we get involved in from this slide here. Indoor stuff from bouldering, speed climbing, rope climbing, you get outdoor climbing, snow sports, touring, hill walking, and then on the very high tops you've got the mountaineering side of things. So there's a whole range of activities. Whatever your level of interest and ability, we'll be catering for it. So the mountain safety side of things, just a brief introduction, that's training workshops and courses, talks, advice, a lot of stuff on the website, and it's for all seasons. So in the summer, in the winter, and those bits in between when you're not quite sure if it's summer or winter or both in the one day. And our work is focused on people, on you, is to help you be safe in the mountains, but not make the mountains safe for people. I think that's a key thing to note. My side of the business is access and conservation, who are campaigning to protect the mountaineering practice. And that's how we go about our business. And it could be access issues due to obstructions, signs, erosion, all sorts of stuff that's going on in the land. And also for the enjoyment of mountaineering. So that's looking at the landscape and the wildlife that you see on your day out in the hills. So there's the two different parts of the sort of the mountaineering sort of that we've been involved in for access and conservation. Climbing as well. Climb Scotland was established in 2015, and that was for competitive indoor climbing. That was a sort of more specialist niche type thing. It was to encourage young people to get involved in the sport, but not just to get involved, but to keep developing their skills and interests too. And that's been going on for 5 years now, and it's really, really successful. So that's from the indoor side of things. How you transition to outdoors is a whole different seminar. And we have our services as well for our members. So we have a website with lots of stuff on it. If you haven't looked at the website, I thoroughly recommend it. There's most of the things that you want to know about are on there somewhere. If you don't know what it is, get in touch with us and we'll point it out to you. We want to encourage enjoyment of the mountains, and it's for everyone, whatever your level of ability, and even your dog. We've got a web page devoted to dogs in the mountains too. It's all there. And we have an active social media presence. So if you get Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you can see what we're about here and keep track of what we're doing then. So access, onto the main part, first part of tonight's presentation, recreational access to Scottish Hills. And imagine you'll all know that we have a right of access to land and inland water in Scotland. But with that right comes responsibilities. And a key part of access in Scotland is the interpretation of what this means for outdoor recreation and also what it means for land management. Because it's not just us going out there and enjoying the hills, it's someone's livelihood as well. So going back to 2003, we had the Land Reform Scotland Act, which was passed. And it states in part 1 of that act that everyone has a statutory right to be on land and to cross land. And note this distinction, is that allows us to linger a while and not just to pass through. It's not just moving from one end to the other. You can stop and look at birds, take photographs. It allows you to linger a wee bit longer. And this applies also above the land and below the surface that we actually walk on. The Act also states the purposes for which the right applies, and that's for recreational purposes, carrying on a relevant educational activity, that's for furthering understanding of natural or cultural heritage, and also for carrying on commercially for profit an activity which the person exercising the right could carry on otherwise than commercially or for profit. So it means that if you can do it, then you can actually charge for it as well. So that takes the likes of guiding, training, and those sort of things where you have a charged activity on the land. If you can do it for free under the access rights, you can also charge for it. It's not to sell things for profit, but it means that you can make commercial activity on the land too. So it sounds wonderful. Then there's this qualifying clause in section 2. We have these access rights only if they're exercised responsibly. And what is meant by responsible? It's a good question, that one. So what the Act says is it's so as not to cause unreasonable interference with the rights of any other person. Sounds fair enough to me as well. So this is where we have to think and take care. What other rights would be infringing by our activity? And then, as it's a balanced thing, there's stated in section 3, there's reciprocal obligations on landowners to manage the land and conduct ownership in a way that respects the access rights. So there's quite a lot in there. And then chapter 2 of the Act lists the exceptions over which these rights do not apply. And there are quite a few clauses there regarding physical situations and type of conduct. It's worth having a look at them actually. Some are perfectly clearly defined. Others are, shall we say, a bit fuzzy around the edges and lend themselves to some discussion of the detail. And that is one of the interesting parts of access. It's where you've got to test yourself, I think, in some situations to find out what you're doing. So it sounds complicated, and it is to a certain extent. So how do you untangle legal jargon? So happily, chapter 3 of the Act provides for the issue of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, and that sets out guidance in plain English of the various points of law. And the starting point is that the code is based on 3 principles. You have 3 main principles in there. The first one is to respect the interests of others, and that's consideration, courtesy, and safety. And then there's care for the environment. So that's to maintain natural features and leave the land as you find it. And the third key principle is take responsibility for your own actions. So remember that the outdoors cannot be made risk-free, and that's quite a key thing to be thinking about as well. So simple principles, but life doesn't fit into neat categories, as we probably all know. And the application of these principles take a bit more discussion. So the Outdoor Access Code, or SOAC as it's commonly known, it helpfully provides more context on what the Act can mean. We're unlikely to be word perfect on this, but the general idea can be taken from reading it. It's not the place to go into in detail, I don't think. That's another webinar entirely, I think, to look at the ins and outs of the Outdoor Access Code. But it's worth having a look through to find out some of the main things that you'll be coming across. So a key question is how these rights and responsibilities are implemented. So first up, you have a local access authority, and there's a statutory duty to uphold these access rights. The access authority can be your local council, and it can also be one of the 2 national parks. So we have 32 local authorities and 2 national parks that are access authorities. The Act also provides for these local access forums, And an access forum is an advisory body. It's made up of representatives of different sectors like recreation and land management. So you can discuss the various perspectives of certain situations that come up, which are causing some problems or challenges. And the Access Authority may also appoint a ranger or another official, an access officer, for instance, to advise and assist. This is currently a big issue, the access officers, as there's been a decline in number of rangers and access officers employed, down 44% since 2005, when SOAC was published. So in the last 15 years, we've lost nearly half of the countryside staff that looked after the access rights and responsibilities. That's quite an issue. So what do access officers do? They deal with obstructions to access, which may be physical, like locked gates and fences. And if you can see the picture here, if you look at the top of the gate and on above the fence to the right there, you'll see there's barbed wire, which is a particularly nasty thing to do. One, for us to get past this obstruction, which is locked, and also as well for deer. If a deer managed to jump over it, it's going to rip his belly open. It's a particularly nasty feature you get on some of these deer fences. So it's an issue that sometimes the access officers have to deal with. We also have to deal with signs that give unhelpful or unlawful information. This sign here says no access, which is currently unlawful, but it could be compliant with the Outdoor Access Code if you added one word. If you said no vehicular access, it's perfectly fine then. That just means that you can't take your car there, but we can walk on it. It can help with redirections of routes where problems may occur further on, because one of the restrictions, exemptions from the access rights was land around where people, so they can have the privacy of their own home. And this track here went by a cottage, so the Access Authority put a diversion in to take it away from the cottage, so the people living there can have the privacy of their garden, really. You can also look at repairs as well. This is a particularly difficult one. I don't think this one was actually repaired. I think what you had there was a redirection where you moved the fence or moved it inside the fence. But the repairs and redirections are a big feature as well as when problems arise and how you deal with them. So an access officer is really quite important in being able to sort of facilitate these sort of countryside situations. And another issue we deal with is negotiated arrangements. That's helping landowners deal with recreational pressures of people crossing land with the right advice to give regarding, for example, dogs and livestock in fields or deer management in this case. The key point here, I think, to remember is that advice should be specific as to the extent and the time. And what that means is that you can't have an open-ended situation. If there's going to be a land management issue, I don't want people to, for safety reasons, to go in there, then you have to state quite specifically the extent of where the management is going to take place and how long it's going to take time, how long it's going to be taking place. And that way, everyone knows where to stand. And sort of maintaining that sort of ethos is quite important for an access officer to do as well. So there's also supplementary guidance. So that's the book, the Outdoor Access Code. There's also other bits which arrive over time. This was devised 15 years ago, and certain situations arise. One of them we can see here is informal camping. It's a recreational activity that's been raising its profile over the last few years, and you probably know it came to a head this summer. So we all have a right to be on land where access rights apply. And remember, we could said you had to be on land as well as crossing through land. And wild camping is one of these recreational activities that we enjoy. Very enjoyable activity for many, way up in the hills and out by loch sides, especially when it isn't raining and the midges aren't out in force. And the responsible behaviour part applies to this too. So SOAC, the Outdoor Access Code, advises that you have the right to put up a lightweight tent for a night or two, and you're advised to avoid camping near to buildings or in fields of livestock. But near roadside camping is popular too and is lawful under the access rights. But the thing to mind here is there are no similar rights to take your vehicle there too. Your car must abide by the Road Traffic Acts and regulations. And there have been increasing problems over the past few years with what we call dirty camping. Near to the roads and car parks. That's where trees have branches lopped off to make fires. campfires blackening the ground, litter and waste being left behind, when actual whole tents being left behind as well in some cases. It's particularly pointless lopping branches off your tree because it's green wood and it doesn't burn, so it's not a particularly useful thing to do, but it's becoming a bit of a problem, and this is why the camping bylaws were instigated in the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, was to deal with these antisocial camping instances. It became such a problem this year that we had to launch a Consider It Camping campaign to remind everyone about what's responsible camping, to raise awareness of the matters that can cause annoyance and frustration to landowners and local communities. The advice is to make careful, thoughtful choices and where and how to camp. It's a learned activity, really, and to tidy up afterwards. Key considerations are what to do about fires, as I mentioned earlier, and where to go to the loo outdoors. If there's no toilets open, how do you deal with that sort of thing? And we've got a web page for it, and you can read the advice there on the web page. And it certainly was quite useful this summer when we sort of circulated it around for folk who are new to this sort of activity to actually find out the ins and outs, of the pros and cons of actually wild camping. So discussion and resolution of issues is a thing. It's not always going to be plain sailing. There's lots of advice, lots of guidance out there, but sometimes you get to those fuzzy areas which I'd mentioned in the Act. And the local access forums are there. They can play a part in these individual situations of local relevance, where you can have a discussion of the issues with the parties involved and come to a considered view based on law and on the guidance. And for more widespread national issues, there's the National Access Forum, on which Mountaineering Scotland has a place, along with a whole host of other organisations. And that's where different sectors of interest come together and discuss the issues and try to come to guidance that will be pragmatic. That guidance in informal camping, for instance, was one issue. The ability to park overnight has been a topic of discussion, quite a long discussion about that. And among other matters like dogs and livestock, and trying to tighten up on the advice for that sort of thing. So we have the local situations, and then we have the national matters to look at too. So what happens when you can't resolve these issues? Well, it's always resource to the courts. You go to the Sheriff Court in the first instance. The Sheriff Court are local rulings, and the other access authorities can follow these discussions that come to the Sheriff Court. But the odd thing here is that although the court can rule on that particular issue and enforce the law and the penalties, the decision is not binding in any other sheriffs, who are free to come to their own conclusions within their own jurisdiction. So what might be the response to a situation in Stirling, for instance, might not apply to Perth, which is quite a strange state of affairs, but it's one of those quirks of the law which we came across during the early implementation of the Land Reform Act. The picture on the slide there you see is Drumleen, and this is quite an interesting case, because if you find that the sheriff's decision is not to your liking, which it wasn't to the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park Authority, they can take it can be appealed against, and it can be taken to the Court of Session for adjudication. And here the judge's decision means that the ruling here is nationally binding, and the explanation and argument becomes case law. So the sheriff is just a local decision, but when you go to the Court of Session, what the judges say means that's it across the whole country. This is how you interpret it precisely. And it can be used as an example in other similar situations. And case law is important, as it's legally binding interpretation of the wording of the Act. SOAC is a status of guidance only. It's a bit like the Highway Code. The Highway Code tells you gives you the rules of the road, as it were, but you are prosecuted under if you do something wrong, you're prosecuted under the Road Traffic Acts. It's the same here. So the Outdoor Access Code tells you how to comport yourself with consideration in the countryside. And if you do something which is deemed irresponsible, then it's the other acts that come in behind you. You have lost that right of access at that particular point if you're deemed irresponsible. So the things that they're talking about is like the extent of privacy around a house, the intent of an action to manage land responsibly or to deter access, and objective evidence for restrictive actions or decisions. This is quite an important one because there was a discussion and it was subjective. I was doing this for land management, therefore it wasn't my intention to block access. But the importance of this Drumleen case in the Loch Lomond and Trossachs area was such that it wasn't so much the subjective intention, it was the objective impact of what they did. So it's not so much as the erection of a gate across a path, but it's the failure to unlock it or to provide for passage, which is the key test now, and that's now been deemed as a sort of a decision, and it's how you understand how it's relevant. It's also very expensive, and over the past 15 or more years, there've been not very many instances of case law pertaining to the right of recreational access. Quite a lot because of that the cost of it all and getting the rights there. I'll stop for a wee bit and have a look at the Q&As. And somebody says, what is the current condition of access rights at the estate near Glenlyon in Invervar? I was wondering if that would come up. I've heard the estate can be sometimes a bit funny with walkers. That's a good question from Douglas Harden. Yes, this is a particularly difficult one because it's a small estate. It's got 4 Monroes, which can be done quite easily in a round. It's very near to the sort of main centres of population, and the estate also like to do deer stalking on the estate as well. So there is a clash of interest there. It has been quite problematic in the past. The access officer for Perth and Kinross Council has been involved in this quite almost continuously, I think, since the Land Reform Act came in. And what the resolution of this has been is that the understanding then is that when you're taking access, the advice from the estate is to walk clockwise round the estate. That way the deer won't be spooked. They'll know what it is, because that's part of the advice within the access code, is to heed responsible advice by land managers. Now you've got to interpret, is it responsible or not? Is this responsible advice? In this case, it is, because if you stick to the ridge lines and if you follow the path and you take in the 4 Monroes in the one way, the deer know where people are going to go. The stalkers know that the deer won't be spooked and they'll be able to take their shots. And it's not just stag shooting. There's also the hind cull in the winter, which is for conservation reasons. If the deer numbers get too high, then there's a lot of damage to the ground. It gets overgrazed, so you've got to keep the hind numbers down. So there's shooting in the winter too. So that's the main outcome from that one. It's a reasonable sort of result. If we just say, yeah, okay, for this particular estate, we'll go clockwise round the 4 Monroes and we'll leave it at that. And hopefully the estate can carry on with their work and we can enjoy that too. So there's the answer for that one. I'm glad to get Invervar out the way because it was going to come up sometime sooner or later. So that's a sort of general overview of access, what's all involved. And it's certainly, there's quite a few cases come in that keep me quite busy, quite puzzling ones. Some are fairly simple and straightforward. Others can be quite a bit more taxing and involves a bit more discussion. So if we move on to the conservation side of things, and the next part of my my job, as it were, what is the conservation of the mountain environment all about? This is quite a sort of a big topic, and it's a brief overview I think we'll give you for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so on this one. Let's go back to sort of 2014, and the Scottish Government had a report on mountains and uplands, and what it says was that since the 1940s, many of the upland habitats and their associated wildlife have declined in extent or worsened in condition. The key messages here were that most of the uplands have been modified through grazing, drainage, tree planting, and deposits of atmospheric pollution, to the extent that near natural habitats are very rare. So that was the context of this in 2014. So what they've actually found that there was direct impacts of land management, and with these more diffuse effects of pollution and climate change stressing out the wildlife in the hills. And land management was like the overgrazing of sheep and deer, badly managed muir burn, where the ground actually gets burnt, and drainage of wetlands as well. And plus, conversely, quite interestingly, the removal of livestock, so undergrazing, was just as bad as overgrazing. There's a happy medium in there somewhere. There's woodland creation with tree planting. So you've seen all these sort of sharp-edged, wall-to-wall Sitka spruce plantations. What wildlife can live in that? There's very, very few species can actually live in there. And there's the atmospheric deposition of pollution. And what that does is it encourages the more vigorous, more competitive vegetation to grow, smothering some of the more delicate plants. So you can see there's a few issues in there from the sort of land use and from the more diffuse side of things. And what we're going to look at is how some of these things can affect us, and especially climate change, which is quite a big issue as well. So your events change in there, like bud burst and bird migration. If you get out of sync, then the food sources that the wildlife relies on become sort of disconnected, and then you can't actually have this sort of a connection. You find there's fragmentation of the habitats, there's isolation, and this is what's causing the declines in wildlife. But it's not all doom and gloom, because as that report also said, there have been some improvements recently. And here you'll see, if you get the management right, there's little juniper growing here. Juniper is quite a tricky one. It doesn't help itself by its life cycle. But you get some juniper growing in here. You see beside the sort of a lovely indigo coloured milkworts in the sward. That was bare, change of management, and you get these plants coming through now. Climate change is quite a difficult one to deal with, because there is a global context in this, and it's increasing seasonal variability in temperature and rainfall and snow through the climate change, and extreme weather events are becoming more common. As you can see from this picture of Rest Be Thankful, many of you know, I don't know if it's still shut or not, but every now and again, every year, at least once a year, it seems to be shut. And the impacts of this on plants and animals as well is quite difficult, because you get erosion, bits of the bank wash away, its habitat washes away, and you get flooding as well, which can flood out where the animals are living. So it is quite a big issue, and it's quite an intractable one to deal with, and it's something that affects the uplands quite sort of profoundly. You'll see that birds in the uplands, there's numbers of breeding birds in the uplands have decreased by 16% from about 1994 onwards. That's quite a large fall. And causes cited were reduced diversity in vegetation structure and composition. So that means there's less variety in the landform. Forest expansion and changes in grazing and other site-based management, including predation as well. And you'll find that upland butterflies have declined sharply over the past 15 years, with northern brown argus populations down more than a quarter, and mountain ringlet and large heath populations dropping by more than a half. And the reasons for this are climate change, a need for large and diverse areas of habitat. So again, it's this diversity, the climate change, diversity of habitats, and monocultures in the uplands. So we look for natural solutions to this climate crisis, as the climate change was mentioned in quite a few of them. So peat bogs, they're a good source of storage of carbon in the blanket bogs. They say on average it lays down peat about 1 millimetre a year, and the key plant for this is sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss and bog cotton are the main ones you want for laying down peat. Very much dependent on hydrology, so drainage and erosion are problems. And here in Scotland is a map of where you'll find peat, and it's fairly common about the place. You will see that the purple and yellow ones are the better quality peat. It's not, it doesn't say they're pristine, but they are the better quality habitats, the peatland areas in Scotland. The other natural solution that you can find is woodland. It's a good carbon storage in timber, but only if that is left to grow. So woodland cover, currently it's about 17% of land area, but much of Scotland is unsuitable for timber production. And note I say timber production, it doesn't mean that trees can't grow there. So it's a different thing altogether. The amount of native tree cover, that's the sort of natural broadleafs that we find, it comes to about 4% of Scotland's land area. And the greatest extents of this natural tree cover are birchwood and pinewood, native pinewood. Quite often planted though, but the important thing about this is the genetics of climate change, because if the seasons are changing and it's a variable and rapid change, you need to have quite a broad genetic diversity to be able to respond to these changes. There'll be a tree somewhere that can respond to that situation. If you reduce the genetic stock, you make them much more unlikely to be able to respond quickly to changes, rapid changes in the environment. So genetics is quite important as well when it comes to sort of plants and animals. And then we have the poor relation, the montane woodland, the missing ecotone, as it's called. There should be a gradual change from forest through small scattered trees to these open dwarf shrubs. And here's another statistic for you. I mentioned that only 4% of Scotland's land area is natural tree cover. Of this native woodland that lies above 400-metre contour, only 4% survives. So again, we've got 4% of 4% of the wee trees in the uplands. This is one of Scotland's rare habitats on the high peak. So it's very fragile. They're very prone to grazing disturbance. So they're hanging on there. This is one of the things that conservation trying to do, is try to increase these sort of small pockets of the montane willows and shrubs in the high mountains. So we've got a question for you. Why do forests have hard edges? Well, I think we all know the answer to that one. It's deer fencing. Straight lines in the landscape. Landscape doesn't have straight lines. So woodland management and design is quite important for a landscape feature. You think forestry's come on since the days when these photographs were taken, when you get hard edge plantations. There's been more softwood expansion and restructuring of the forests, and it's evolved quite a bit. And the plantings are much more sensitive to the landscape now. And wildlife interest too. Forestry is more just a crop that could be home for wildlife. You see here, deer live in the forest. That's where they naturally come to live. They're not open range beasts, they're actually woodland beasts. And these increasing areas of woodland provide stepping stones of habitats, and it reduces that fragmentation and isolation that causes the biodiversity declines. Now it's time to move into a realm of controversy and fling in the controversial word rewilding. So it has quite strong connotations, rewilding. It can be many things to many people. It's not really about wolves and bears, to be honest. It's really all about ecological restoration. It's habitat management, letting nature run its course along its own path, as it were. So although wolves are quite iconic, that's not the main driver for rewilding. The main driver for rewilding is to have a more natural system. It's to increase land surface roughness, to reduce water flow, the scouring and flooding downstream, create mosaics of habitat types through natural tree regeneration, peatland restoration and protection, and good moorland management as well. What it's not about is about depeopling landscapes. It's finding a natural balance of wildlife and people and what we do. We need to have a transition to a new nature-based economy in which the wildlife takes its place alongside the people and what we're doing. So that's what we think rewilding is about. And we think it's a good thing for the uplands, it's a good thing for wildlife, and it'll be a good thing for rural communities as well, if they can make some sort of economic return from it too. Moving on to another topic of the uplands is wildland, which is another quite a topic of interest in the uplands. It's a national asset according to the National Planning Framework, which means that we need to look after it. The Scottish Government thinks wildland areas are special. And they've been mapped to show where the best examples of these wild qualities can be found. Now, they don't necessarily have the same protection that sites of special scientific interest and national scenic areas have in legislation, but planning policy advises that consideration of their qualities must be taken into account for these sort of developments. Hill walkers know all about them because, whoop, I'm going the wrong way here. There we go. As you can see, there's 260 Munros and 177 Corbetts are in wildland areas. So we should know all about wildland. Mountaineers have benefited from the old paths and trails up into the hills. So the wildland is not wild is in pristine wilderness. There's all these bothies, and there's features of history and culture in the Scottish mountains, so they have been used in the past. We're not looking at landscapes in which the footprint of humankind has not been made. It's the qualities of wildness as opposed to wilderness that we're talking about here. And also, with increasing popularity of mountains, they're very likely to have an increased impact in these areas in the future, with path erosion on the more popular routes. And many of you I know will know some well-eroded paths. So we do create our own problems in these wildland areas, and it's not just other people's problems. We do have to create problems too. So there's a responsibility on us to be able to look at these sort of wildland areas and our impact on them. So this impact is acknowledged, but you find that newly bulldozed hill tracks also create a bit of an uproar, a bit of furore. And we've had a member survey fairly recently, and you find that 95% of the respondents to our survey indicated that they were seen as a significant risk to the wild qualities of land. So campaigning in hill tracks is something that we do quite strongly. Hill tracks for agricultural and forestry operations have less planning oversight than for other developments. Forestry tracks have national standards to work to, but agricultural tracks, we think, need to be brought into more rigorous examination. And we're going to be campaigning next year to look at these permitted development rights and try to have much more sort of firmer oversight of how these tracks are, where they go and to what standard they're built to avoid having the damage. It's not saying no tracks whatsoever. It's not so much the activity in itself, it's how it's done, I think, is the main problem there. So the look of the mountains and wild land has always depended on the rural economy and the viability of upland land uses and businesses. But as you can see here, as I said, it's not what we do, but how we do it. And hopefully those forestry blocks, when they get felled and restructured, will look somewhere different. But we will have quite permanent impacts into these wildland areas here in the Monalias, for instance. That will not change now, and it will take decades, if not centuries, for the landscape to try and soften. They say that, oh yeah, it'll grow over and soften, but the rate of growth in upland areas can be a lot slower than you imagine. And it can take quite some time for damage to repair itself in the upland areas. So I think that most mountaineers wouldn't be expecting wildland to be totally devoid of human influence. Although those that are a premium and very highly valued, it's that degree of intrusion of the development activities that is the key thing. So what are we doing about it? Well, we've created a conservation strategy that informs our view of all these impacts on the uplands. So we've got 3 main areas of interest in here. It's to look at policy and practice to reverse the homogenisation of this landscape, and we've got land use and wildlife, wildland developments, and it's also the personal responsibility, as I mentioned before, the impact that we have on the environment in pursuit of our enjoyment. So what we've got in land use and wildlife, what we're calling natural tree lines, it's where the impact of wild deer, the impact of grouse moors, and the impact of forestry does not create this sort of gap in the tree line in Scotland. It's where you can find trees are moving from the low areas up to the high tops. Not everywhere covered with trees, obviously, but there is enough continuity that wildlife corridors working their way through the mountains. This is something that we think is quite important for wildlife, for the look of the land, and also for the wildlife that lives there. Also, again, for the protection of the wild, the qualities, these essential qualities of wildland and how we do things. Glenettive was an example where we campaigned quite strongly on that. There was 7 run-of-river hydro schemes proposed, 4 of which were on the west side in the forestry. Fine. It was disturbed ground. There was development there already. Ideal place to put your 4 run-of-river hydro schemes. But in the untouched eastern side, below the slopes of Ben Starrow, for instance, these were major civil engineering sort of projects going into land which has been only very lightly touched. There are paths there, but they're very small stalkers paths. We were talking about aggregates, concrete, big trucks going in there to change the shape of the landscape in there. So we objected to these 3. Unfortunately, Highland Council thought that all 7 were viable and they went ahead. But that's the sort of topics that we will campaign on. Not all 7 of them, just the ones that were going to be the most damaging ones. And then we have a recreational activity, the personal responsibility. As I said, path erosion. How do we deal with path erosion? How do we pay for repairs? The volunteer groups can do that if you have some organisation for that. But landowners who don't have access to that sort of degree of organisation, where do they get the funding from to repair this erosion that we create? It's something that is taxing the hill walking community. Fundraising and finding sources of funding to be able to get contractors in to repair the damage that we cause. And then the mess we leave behind, tack it home. That's the simple message for our litter campaign. I think the strapline for this is, if you don't pick it up, who will? So it's not leaving stuff behind in the hills. I mean, you say, oh, banana peel, orange peel and banana skins, they're biodegradable. Yeah, but it takes about 3 years to degrade. So still got to pick these things up. They're still quite unsightly. So this is our campaign to tack it home, where you have a bag in your rucksack, especially for picking up your rubbish and other people's rubbish as well, where it's safe to do. I must say that, where it's safe to do so. But pick up other people's rubbish too, and try and leave the hills free of all the plastic and the paper and glass and metal and such like that lies about the place. It's social responsibility. That's what it is. We create the mess. We should clear it up. So it's great. And I think we can announce that the Tack It Home campaign came third in the TGO campaign awards this year. So I'm very chuffed that we have managed to win an award for this campaign. I think it's worthwhile. It's a good thing to do, to tack it home. And going back to climate change, we have our Climate Response Action Group. And if you read down, you'll see there's a very cute acronym there, CRAG, our Climate Response Action Group. CRAG is for the big issues. It's a small group of members, experts in this field, advising on our carbon footprint, our carbon handprint, and whatever else we do, which causes or exacerbates the impacts of climate change. It's to ensure that action and intent to address climate crisis becomes a core activity within all that we do in our mountaineering activities, and to communicate that to everyone that's engaged in mountaineering activities, not just ourselves, not just our members, but anyone who is into the hills, to think about the issues and how we can address them. And look out for an announcement coming in the new year, in January, about how we can do something to mitigate our travel into the hills for our enjoyment. We've got a new initiative taking place, and if you look on our social media come January, you'll be able to do something about it. So that's what we're starting to address for the climate change issues. So really, the future is our members' views matter. It's you that creates what we're interested in, what our priorities are. And it's also how we deal with things. And if the more members we have, the more clout we have with government, we can get funding, we can get policies in place, and we can also comport ourselves in a more considerate and responsible fashion in the hills. So we invite you to join if you're not already a member, and let your views be known. Lots of benefits in there. We're reliant on funding from a combination of membership subscriptions and non-governmental grants. This is where we get the money to be able to do all this sort of thing. You have your benefits of getting Scottish Mountaineer magazine, arguably the best climbing and walking magazine in Britain, I would say. And you get discounts, outdoor shops, places to stay, access to subsidised mountain skills courses, network of mountaineering huts, take part in climbing competitions and coaching, and liability insurance for your mountaineering activities. So your membership work supports the work we do representing hill walkers, climbers and ski tourers in Scotland, and our campaigns as well, to protect the access rights, to protect our mountain landscapes, and to promote the responsibilities of access to our hills and crags. So I hope you found that interesting. I'll go into the Q&A session now and see what we've got. We've got 5 questions in here. There's one that was asking, is that reasonable out with stocking season though? I think that'll be one of the ones that was for the Invervar one. The stocking season tends to go through the whole year. There's 2 stocking seasons. There's the stag season, which is from August to October. And then you have the hind season, which goes through from October right through to February. And then you've got the gap in the middle, that summer period where there is no stocking. Then you can walk where you think, where they aren't stocking, then I think you are able to take access according to the access legislation. So I think that's the scope there. It's where the stocking season is in place, then that is reasonable advice. Why has there been a decrease in ranger numbers? It's funding, basically. Local authority funding has been squeezed and have making cutbacks. Local authorities are falling back on their statutory duties, and there is no statutory function to provide an access officer. The Act provides for you, they may provide an access officer. So it comes down to your local authority having the money to be able to do this sort of thing. I have said that, I will say though, that the Scottish Government have now noticed that since the lockdown, COVID-19 not lockdown, we found that the people on the ground were the most effective way of dealing with the visitor recreation pressures over the summer. And that's something we need to look at. How do we get the funding to provide for more seasonal rangers over the summer to help ease the access pressures on the countryside? There's a question from Alistair about the situation at Culleter Cottage in Glenetiv. Seems that the estate owner fenced off a huge area and presented it as a fait accompli. Disproportionate for a small seasonal residence and no proper path around it when I was last there. Yes, there are issues there which the Highland Council will be looking at. There was a diversion put in place, but it went across peat bog, and the number of people walking across it chewed up the land, and it's become a very horrible, mucky, peaty porridge to walk through. So there are issues there. If you have issues like that, concerns about these sort of things, write to the local or email the local authority access officer about it. They'll be the first point of contact in it, and they will know what's going on. This is one of the ways to ensure that access officers are still in post, because the more issues that arise that an access officer has to deal with, the more money that the local authority will have to provide to maintain this presence to deal with those issues that are affecting them. So it keeps them in a job. So if you do have any sort of problems and concerns like these sort of things, get in touch with the local access authorities, access officer, and let them know all about it and see what we can do about it. So that's what I would say for that. Ilona's asking, are there any examples of rewilding out with Scotland which you find to be particularly successful, which we could consider applying trialling in Scotland? I think we've got our own successes in Scotland. If you look at what's happening in Glenfeshie, for instance, in which the deer numbers were brought down to less than 5 beasts per square kilometre, the trees just sprung up. The seed bank is still viable. It's the actual grazing pressure in there. So if we can reduce it in certain areas, the trees will come back. I showed a slide in there, I didn't mention it at the time, but there's a slide in there of Craigmeggy. Again, another area where the grazing pressure was reduced and the trees have started to find their way up the hillside. This is natural regeneration. Trees are growing where they will grow naturally. We're not planting them in there. They're finding their own association where the soils are right for them, where the fungus association is right for them, because trees and fungus have a symbiotic relationship. And this is why a lot of planting schemes don't actually come to fruition, because the fungus isn't in the soil that helps the tree grow. So it grows as long as the nutrients are in there, the sort of potassium and the sort of potash and phosphorus. They'll grow when all these nutrients are there, then they'll stop. But the fungus helps it grow. So where trees grow naturally means that they will survive. So this natural regeneration, I think, is quite important. And there are places in Scotland, I think, which are good examples. And it's just a question of promoting them more, talking to the forestry people about them, which I do all the time. I respond to forestry applications and say, by the way, a good example of this is Craigmeggy or Glenfeshie, for instance. And there seems to be more of an enlightened attitude amongst some estate owners about how we can actually manage this one. So yes, I don't think we need to look beyond Scotland. I think we've got the answers ourselves in our own country. Denise is saying, our club is thinking of developing a green statement and a set of key actions each member should consider. Are there any examples of this? Well, Denise, that's exactly what we're doing ourselves here. We've done this exercise within the staff, and we've looked at our carbon footprint of travel on business. And I was horrified to find that in the financial year 2019 to 2020, I emitted 1 metric tonne of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere on Mountaineering Scotland's business. So I'm going to try and get this down. It's not easy for every one of our members to do this, or our staff members to do this, because we have to go to places where there is no public transport to deliver sort of workshops and training courses. We have to carry stuff about the place. So we will look at this where we can. And there'll be a new initiative coming out in January, I say, looking at travel, recreational travel, and how to mitigate the carbon in there. So watch this space. We have our members who are experts in this. Craig's providing more guidance, and we will disseminate this to clubs as we are developing them. Joe's asking, can I identify any positives which will come out of the COVID pandemic in areas of focus, either access or conservation? I think, yes, a positive from the COVID pandemic is people are finding what's in their backyard. Used to go far away. Oh yeah, I'll go further away to go to places for recreation. There's some gorgeous, great places nearby. And you can see this summer where, in actual fact, we've had lots of problems with vehicles causing blockages on roads. This is one of the negative sides of COVID, the fact that there was no public transport and car sharing isn't viable anymore. So every one person who goes out has to take their own car. But it also shows that Scotland's countryside is a real big attraction to people. There was a survey done by Nature Scott a couple of years back, and they reckoned that there was 13.8 million visits to the countryside for hill walking over a year. That's an enormous number of visits in there. And I think the sort of the lockdown and the release from lockdown has shown folk that our countryside is really quite spectacular and it's a good place to go. And I think that more people will be staying over and camping over in Scotland. So I see that as a positive outcome, the silver lining in the COVID cloud, as it were. John is asking, what is the position on overnight stays in a camper van in a car park layback? Is it all subject to local rules? You can park your car on someone else's land, but you have no right to leave it there. So you can stop on the land, but you can't park overnight unless you have the permission or the tacit assent of the landowner. In a lay-by on a road, you can sleep there because that's for road safety. So if you're on a road and there's an official lay-by in there, you can stop and snooze in your car for a bit because that's a safety measure. But if you're taking your camper van off the road and camping overnight, there is no law that allows you to do that, but the landowner may tolerate that and allow you to do that sort of thing. If you park your car and put your tent up, you can put your tent up okay, but your car parked there is still subject to the Road Traffic Act, and that is the landowner's consent for you to leave your car there. So that's quite a tricky one that's one of those grey fuzzy areas I was talking about. So you can tent camp, but you can't camp in your camper van. But we're looking at how the National Access Forum is looking at how sort of more informal areas can be developed. And Forest and Land Scotland have been trialling some of these sort of overnight camping things. So watch this space. Things are moving on this front. Tim's asking, do landowners have a right to prevent access to land where they perceive there a risk from rockfalls or landslips? Yes, is the short answer, but it's not a simple answer. Landowners have a duty of care and you have to have a risk assessment to assess if that is going to cause a problem. You'll find that access to part of Salisbury Crags in Edinburgh has been withdrawn because the landowner can do that because Holyrood Park has bylaws that allow them to do that. And there's a health and safety risk in there. If it's a man-made feature, then the landowner could be prosecuted under the Health and Safety Act and the sort of and for the duty of care for the Land Occupiers Liability Act as well. Again, this is one of those interesting discussion areas in which we look at each case is looked at on its own merit, and it's very difficult to make a snap sort of overall judgment on it. It depends on the situation, the type of access, the type of rockfall and landslip, and whether you can take your access in there. So I would think that it depends on each individual case, but yes, they can for health and safety. Yes, they can for owners' the occupier's liability, but it has to be proportionate and it has to be sort of well thought through. It can't be just a blanket ban, I would say. So I think that's most of the questions. If there's any other questions you'd have, I'm quite happy to answer your questions there. And if not, then I hope you found that sort of interesting, sort of informative, and stimulated you to go and read the Scottish Outdoor Access Code if you haven't done so already. There's lots in there, and it certainly poses some questions. We have an access quiz if you're interested. It's on our website under the Safety and Skills page, and you can test your knowledge of the Outdoor Access Code there on our interactive access quiz. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming along and listening to me talk on for a wee bit about this. And I hope it's given you a sort of flavour of the scope of what Mountaineering Scotland gets involved in. We do a lot of work. There's a lot of sort of grey areas and fuzzy areas that need a bit of negotiation, but it's all for the benefit of ourselves, enjoying our land, our occupation, our recreation, and it's also for environmental protection too. I think that's one of the key things to say. It's not just pure selfish, it's for the future generations too. So thank you very much, folks.